Hey, Antique, hurry up or get out now. Those were the sharp, biting words of a young, brash musician, his voice dripping with mockery as it echoed through the lavish dining hall. The room, filled with Hollywood's elite, fell into a stunned silence. All eyes turned to the man at the center of the jab, none other than the legendary Clint Eastwood. The musician's taunt was meant to humiliate, to strip away the icon's dignity in front of his peers. But what happened next would leave everyone in the room, including the scheming mastermind behind this cruel stunt, utterly speechless. It all began earlier that evening at a grand dinner party hosted by Clint Eastwood himself. The event was a glittering affair, a celebration of Hollywood's finest held at Clint's sprawling estate. The guest list was a who's who of the industry, directors, actors, producers, all gathered to honor the man whose career had spanned decades, from gritty westerns to Oscar-winning dramas. Clint, now in his 90s, still carried the same commanding presence that had made him a household name. His sharp eyes and quiet confidence were as much a part of him as the iconic squint he'd perfected on screen. But not everyone in attendance was there to celebrate Clint. Among the guests was Kevin, a rising Hollywood star in his late 30s, known for his charm and good looks, but also for a simmering resentment that few ever saw. Kevin had been in the industry for over a decade, and while he'd achieved success, he could never shake the feeling that he was living in the shadow of legends like Clint. To Kevin, Clint represented everything he both admired and despised, an untouchable figure whose fame and respect seemed effortless, unearned in Kevin's bitter mind. Deep down, Kevin was consumed by jealousy, and he had spent weeks plotting a way to bring Clint down a peg, to expose him as a fraud in front of the very people who revered him. Kevin had approached Clint a few days before the party, with a seemingly innocent offer. He'd suggested arranging a musician for the evening, a small gesture to add some flair to the event. Clint, always gracious, had agreed without a second thought. He had no reason to suspect Kevin's true intentions. After all, Kevin had always been polite in public, masking his envy behind a polished smile. But behind the scenes, Kevin had a plan to humiliate Clint in the most public way possible. Kevin had hired a young liberal musician named Ethan, a talented but arrogant pianist known for his outspoken views and disdain for Hollywood's old guard. Ethan was the perfect pawn for Kevin's scheme. Kevin had met Ethan at a charity event a few months prior, and the two had bonded over their shared frustration with the industry's reverence for aging stars. Kevin had planted the idea in Ethan's head. What if they could make Clint Eastwood, the tough guy legend, look like a fool? Ethan, eager to make a name for himself and fueled by his own disdain for traditional icons, had jumped at the chance. The night of the party arrived and the atmosphere was electric. Guests mingled in the opulent dining hall, their laughter and chatter filling the air. The room was adorned with warm lighting, elegant decor, and a grand piano that sat in the corner, a centerpiece that would soon become the stage for Kevin's cruel plot. Ethan had arrived early, setting up at the piano and playing soft classical melodies as the guests trickled in. He was charming, his fingers dancing across the keys with effortless skill, but his eyes kept darting toward Kevin, waiting for the signal to set the plan in motion. Clint, ever the gracious host, moved through the crowd with a quiet dignity. He greeted his guests warmly, sharing stories from his long career and listening intently as others spoke. Despite his age, there was a sharpness to him, a strength that hadn't faded with time. He was unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface, the storm that Kevin had carefully orchestrated. As the evening progressed, the guests sat down for dinner, their plates filled with gourmet dishes and their glasses brimming with fine wine. The mood was jovial, the conversation lively, but Kevin, seated near the front of the room, couldn't hide the glint of anticipation in his eyes. He leaned over to Ethan, who had taken a break from playing to join the guests for dinner, and whispered something in his ear. Ethan nodded, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was time. Ethan stood up, smoothing his sleek black suit as he made his way back to the piano. The room quieted slightly as the guests noticed his movement, expecting another round of beautiful music to accompany their meal. But Ethan had other plans. He sat down at the piano, his fingers hovering over the keys for a moment, and then he turned to face the crowd. His voice, loud and commanding, cut through the hum of conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan began, his tone laced with a mocking edge, "we're in for a real treat tonight. I've heard that our esteemed host, Mr. Clint Eastwood, is quite the musician. Why don't we give him a chance to show us what he's got?" The room fell silent, the guests exchanging confused glances. Clint, who had been mid-conversation with a fellow director, looked up, his expression unreadable. Kevin, sitting a few tables away, leaned back in his chair, a smug smile playing on his lips. He was certain Clint would falter, that the old man would decline or worse, attempt to play and fail miserably. Either way, Kevin would get what he wanted, a moment of public humiliation for the man he envied so deeply. Ethan didn't stop there. He turned directly to Clint, his voice growing sharper, more taunting. "Hey, antique, hurry up or get out now." The words were a deliberate jab, meant to provoke, to embarrass. A few guests gasped, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The insult hung in the air, heavy and cruel. Clint didn't react immediately. He sat there for a moment, his steely gaze fixed on Ethan. The room held its breath, waiting to see how the legend would respond. Kevin's smirk widened. He was sure he'd won. But then Clint did something no one expected. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, and began walking toward the piano. The guests watched in stunned silence as Clint approached the instrument. Ethan, still seated at the piano, looked up at him with a mix of amusement and disdain. He slid over on the bench, making room for Clint, fully expecting the older man to fumble through a few notes and prove Kevin's point. But Clint didn't sit down right away. Instead, he stood there, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the piano, his eyes scanning the room. He took in the faces of his guests, the tension in the air and the smug satisfaction on Kevin's face, and then he spoke. "I've been around a long time," Clint said, his voice low and steady, the same gravelly tone that had captivated audiences for decades. "I've seen a lot of things, met a lot of people. Some of them think they can tear others down to build themselves up. But let me tell you something. Real talent doesn't need to mock anyone to shine." The words were directed at Ethan, but everyone in the room knew they were meant for Kevin, too. Kevin's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, leaning forward in his seat, eager to see Clint fail. Clint, however, had no intention of failing. He sat down at the piano, his posture relaxed but confident, and placed his hands on the keys. What happened next was nothing short of miraculous. Clint's fingers began to move, and the room was filled with the most beautiful, intricate melody anyone had ever heard. It was a jazz piece, complex and soulful, the kind of music that spoke of a lifetime of experience, of joy and pain and everything in between. The notes flowed effortlessly, each one perfectly placed, each chord resonating with a depth that left the guest in awe. Ethan's smirk vanished almost immediately. He stared at Clint, his mouth slightly agape, as the older man played with a skill that rivaled even the most seasoned professionals. The guests, too, were captivated. They leaned forward in their seats, their eyes wide, their whispers of amazement filling the room. Clint wasn't just playing the piano, he was commanding it, weaving a story through the music that held everyone in its grip. Kevin's face turned pale. This wasn't supposed to happen. Clint was supposed to stumble, to embarrass himself, to give Kevin the moment of triumph he'd been craving. But instead, Clint was stealing the show, proving once again why he was a legend. The more Clint played, the more Kevin's plan unraveled. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clenching into fists as the realization set in. He had underestimated Clint Eastwood, and now he was paying the price. Clint played for several minutes, his performance building to a crescendo that left the room breathless. When he finally stopped, the last note hanging in the air like a whisper, the room erupted into applause. The guests were on their feet, clapping and cheering, their admiration for Clint stronger than ever. Ethan, still seated beside him, looked like he'd seen a ghost. He couldn't believe what he'd just witnessed, and for the first time that evening, he was speechless. Clint stood up, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. He turned to Ethan, his voice steady. "That's how it's done, son," he said simply, before walking back to his seat. The guests continued to applaud, their cheers following him as he moved through the crowd. But Clint wasn't done yet. He had one more thing to address, the man who had orchestrated this entire fiasco. As Clint sat down, he looked directly at Kevin, his gaze piercing. Kevin tried to hold his stare, but he couldn't. The weight of Clint's eyes, the weight of his own failure, was too much. Clint leaned forward slightly, his voice low but firm, ensuring Kevin heard every word. "I know what you did," Clint said. "I know you planned this thinking you could make a fool out of me. But let me tell you something, Kevin. Jealousy doesn't make you better. It makes you smaller. If you want to be great, you don't tear others down. You build yourself up through hard work, through integrity. That's the lesson you need to learn tonight." The words hit Kevin like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The guests around him had heard Clint's statement, and they turned to Kevin, their expressions a mix of shock and disapproval. Kevin's carefully crafted image, the charming facade he'd worked so hard to maintain, was crumbling before his eyes. He had wanted to humiliate Clint, but instead, he had humiliated himself. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Kevin. The guests continued to praise Clint, their admiration for him only growing after his stunning performance. Ethan, too, was humbled. He approached Clint later in the evening, his head bowed, and apologized for his behavior. Clint, ever the bigger man, accepted the apology with a nod, but his message was clear. Respect isn't given, it's earned.